and the conference more largely was whether priests who had been convicted, who had admitted to sexual assault, were permitted to return to the ministry. Now, you remember that being a point of contention?
Sorry?
Do you remember that being a point of contention?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
What were the arguments by those who believed such people should return to the ministry?
They believed that a good psychiatrist could, if not totally cure a person, then at least bring them to a point where they would not offend again. Mm-hmm. And I believe that a number of psychiatrists gave those assurances to bishops. In other words, it's not true to say that every bishop was acting totally irresponsibly in cases. They were, you know, a reputable psychiatrist had assured them this man can be returned to ministry. And so they felt that, and I would have shared those beliefs for quite a number of years up till the time. See, what changed for me in 1994? We've sort of almost joked about bishops setting up committees, but now I was part of that committee, so there was no way I could sit back and let others do it and wait for them. Now I had to do these things, so now for the first time I really had to face this sort of question. And I did think about it, and eventually, I know you've got in there, I wrote an article giving all the reasons why a priest should never be returned to ministry. But I don't claim I had all those ideas on the first day back in the 1980s. I came to them and I thought them through and put them down and put them to bishops. But they were coming at different paces. There was always this loyalty to priests question that was there. And you know, things changed there. Psychiatrists wouldn't have been making the same claims longer by the mid-90s.
Did repentance have anything to do with those who believed that an accused or a person who had admitted or was convicted of child sexual abuse could return to the ministry?
Yes, yes. For a lot of bishops, the fault was a moral one. And the sin was a sexual sin. That was the big mortal sin. The harm that might have been caused to the minor was not treated as seriously, was not realised often. That came slowly. So that they simply adopted the policy that the Church had had for centuries in dealing with its concept of sexual sin. That if you repented, you were forgiven and you were restored. And so they would have seen, well, that's what we should do here. Years later, I had that debate with some of the people in Rome. I'm sure we'll get to that. And they, you know, one cardinal, very eminent one, said to me straight out, you know, to me personally, you're not a Christian, you don't believe in forgiveness. And I said, well, I do believe in forgiveness, but there's all the difference in the world between forgiving for a past wrong and preventing a future wrong. And to prevent a future wrong, you cannot appoint such people again. But yes, that's been one of the big issues of getting them away from the mortal sexual sin to a real appreciation of the harm done to the victim as, you know, that alone, that's what makes God angry, that harm done to the victim, not the sex.
Now,
who was that cardinal?
That was Cardinal Tarcio Bertone. He became later Secretary of State. That's why I say he was an eminent cardinal.
We'll come to your document shortly, Bishop. Now, as part of your work and your predecessor committee, there was research commissioned into this area, wasn't there?
Well, I mean, yes, one of the projects we did, which we termed Towards Understanding, was to get two people to do some research into literature, particularly, yes.
Perhaps if we can have tab 50. If you go to tab 50, Bishop. what's termed the Professional Standards Research Project.
Yes.
And this was a project that was commissioned by either the committee or the Bishops' Conference.
The committee.
The committee. And what was your view of the work that they did?
I felt they did a good review of the literature as it was then. As I'm sure you understand, the literature has since multiplied by a factor of, I don't know, 100 or something. It's vast now. But in those years, it was more manageable. And I thought there was a good survey of the literature. Where I had a problem with them was in the second part. They were to contact psychiatrists, psychologists who'd treated priests and, ask them question and answer. But I felt that they were doing that with a relatively small number of professionals, and that they did it by post. They did have some meetings, but they also sent out a questionnaire asking them to write their responses. And I've always found that unsatisfactory. People tend to give monosyllabic answers or, yes, no, which doesn't tell you much. And then I felt the researchers were drawing conclusions that were too definite from too small a base. And I had a problem with that, and I expressed it to them. I felt that they would have been better indicating, this area would benefit from further research, this other area, etc. In other words, pointing us in directions. But I felt that they instead jumped to conclusions which I found problematic, and which I felt I could not simply present to the bishops as the result of, here's the result of research. One of the researchers in particular became angry with me when I did that and responded by promptly releasing the entire document to the media, who, needless to say, went through, grabbed the high spots and published them, etc. Leaving me with egg on my face in front of the bishops, who were not happy with the outcome and therefore not happy with me. But it's the way that project ended up. It was not a success. And I must take responsibility for that.
Now, in April the next year, 1996, what became Towards Healing was presented to the Bishops' Conference?
Not Towards Healing as such. It was a whole lot of principles behind it. For example, the one we mentioned a bit earlier, whether a priest should be reappointed. And we made a distinct recommendation and a motion that he should not.
Well, perhaps if we can have tab 58, if you can look at that, Bishop, they're the minutes of the meeting where your work was reflected in a variety of motions.
Yep.
And the meeting that ultimately resulted in those motions being carried was, I take it, one which was characterised by debate.
Oh, yes. Is it worthwhile to give a little of the context?
Thank you.
Before it, on the Sunday the 14th of April, John Usher, Angela Ryan and myself made a presentation at Sydney University to what was called an International Conference on Sexual Abuse. And that was the one where I answered a question by saying I was not happy with the support we were getting from Rome and with the consequences that came out of that. Then on the following Tuesday, I think it was, a priest was arrested in Wollongong and paraded before the cameras. I think on the Wednesday, Bishop Murray appeared before the Royal Commission, the Wood Royal Commission, and did badly. And then the bishops were meeting, and the media were all over that. And we spent it was the question of that conference. There were 26 motions. There was lots of debate on all of them. We finished finally, and on the 26th, Friday, I spent the whole day in front of the media, finishing up with the 7:30 report that night. And, we were the topic. That was the news everywhere. And then on the 28th of April, 1996, was Port Arthur, that terrible event, which blew everything off the front pages of the paper. And I finally got a night's sleep, I remember, after. But all this was in the middle of those 2 weeks. It was a really hectic, and it was, you know, there was intense media interest in every last thing we were doing. So, yes, there was great debate on a lot of these things. You can, if I may point to...
Certainly.
Say you'll see motions 3 and 4.
Yes.
Will you see those?
Yes.
3 says that in reviewing and updating these 2 documents, the Professional Standards Committee do all in its power to bring into harmony the concerns of complainants' victims and all proper and appropriate measures for the defence of claims before the courts and the fulfilment of the Church's civil obligations. Now that, the last part of that particularly, was a definite concern of a number of bishops. So I had to acknowledge it. But then having done so, I've got motion 4, that if, after every effort has been made to harmonise the concerns expressed in motion 3, there remain issues that are unresolved, the bishops and religious leaders commit themselves to making their first priority a response to complainants' victims that is both just and compassionate. And that was the only way I could get that through, by first acknowledging their concerns and saying we would look after them. But then having said that, saying, however, our priority will be, that is, our priority of the bishop should be, seeing to the complainant victims. But all of this was what I could get out of the bishops. And I was, very conscious of a number of older bishops, particularly, vastly senior to me, who were really uneasy about, so that everything, every word here had to go past the lawyers first before I could move it in front of the conference. And in fact, they were all sent to a quite eminent lawyer, Frank Costigan in Melbourne, who'd been a Royal Commissioner himself. And everything had to go through that. There was fierce debate, but I have to add, almost all of these motions were passed by a majority of about 35 to 6. Now, that's a strong majority. In other words, they came on board, however reluctantly, however hesitantly, but they came on board. There were 6 no, I would never have got, but the rest, they weren't always so good at implementing it later, but they did come on board and support the thrust of what we were trying to achieve.
Now, in addition to the principles and procedures, there was also a motion, which is motion 13, about coordinating a study of factors peculiar to the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Number 86.
Yes.
Did that happen?
Well, that's the one that we were talking about a moment ago.
I see. That's the same one.
Yeah, it's the same one, which happened and didn't happen. It didn't get to the result we wanted. So we then transferred that idea over to long enough to come up with the real answers we wanted there.
No, just while you're talking about Encompass, Bishop, that was established but became a very costly exercise, I take it.
Well, in fairness to the bishops, we set up
Costly exercise, I take it.
Well, in fairness to the bishops, we set up a best practice. What we were hearing by then was that sending them to an individual psychiatrist was not good enough. It needed to be a professional program run by a whole group of people. So Encompass had several psychologists, art therapy, which is a real place in the treatment of people. Because often through something like art, they'll betray a whole lot of things they'll never betray in words. So it was an attempt at best practice, but for that very reason it cost.
And ultimately, the numbers of priests and religious referred to Encompass weren't sufficient to keep it going.
They were not enough to keep it going. We tried everything. We had all sorts of other programs associated with it. And we met the problem there that people didn't want to go to Encompass because of its reputation of dealing with sexual offenders. And so they were afraid that if they self-referred there, for example, for depression, be instantly labelled as a sexual offender. And they didn't want that. And since it was announced that I was appearing here, I've had a letter from one such priest saying, make sure you tell them that, you know, we weren't all sex offenders there, because that was their great fear, and that kept a lot of people away.
Was it also the case that the bishop, who was responsible for the diocese from where the priest came, had to pay for the treatment?
No, the priest never paid, I don't think. The diocese was supposed to.
Yes.
That became a big problem, particularly for country dioceses. You know, small dioceses, and $50,000 is a lot of money.
Particularly if the priest was no longer in ministry.
That's correct, if the priest would never work as a priest again.
Now, coming to the motions that were moved, in addition there was a pastoral letter that was produced.
Correct.
And that was part of the process of moving towards healing.
Well, that and more. As you see, it came up with a 9-point plan, of which towards healing was only one part. In other words, we wanted this to be a more comprehensive response. So certainly it talks about towards healing, but it also talks about setting up what became Encompass. It talks about you know, what do you call it now? Not a bill of rights, a
Code of conduct.
Code of conduct for priests, you know, and things like that. So in other words, a more comprehensive response. It included appearing before the Royal Commission or making a submission to that Royal Commission, the Wood Commission, and various other things.
Now, those motions, as we can see, were carried in April 1996, and it was April 1997 when Towards Healing was publicly launched.
I think it was March, but anyway, around that time. Yeah.
Now, by the time that had occurred, there'd been an event relevant to the Archdiocese of Melbourne.
Indeed, they had. The Melbourne bombshell. Suddenly, out of nowhere, really, in the latter part of 1996, suddenly Melbourne announced it was coming out with its own protocol for responding to complaints.
And when you say Melbourne, you mean Archbishop Pell as
I mean Archbishop Pell in Melbourne. It never applied to Melbourne, you know, it only applied to diocesan priests. So if there was a religious priest down there who had offended, that would come under Towards Healing.
But hadn't Archbishop Pell been a member of the Bishops' Conference all the way through the late 1980s up until your committee?
All the way through all the discussions.
And he'd participated in discussions about it?
Correct.
And I presume he was one of the 35 or 36 who approved it?
I wouldn't know which way he voted. That would be up to him. He was there for all those discussions and motions, yes.
Was it a closed ballot?
I don't remember. I don't remember.
Have you come to understand why he created the Melbourne response when he did, given that Towards Healing was very close to finalisation?
What he said to me was that he'd attended a function one Sunday afternoon in Melbourne, and the Premier was there, of Victoria. And the subject of abuse was, you know, as I've indicated, was much in the air, particularly that April time. And the Premier was Geoff Kennett, and he said that Geoff Kennett had said to him, "You fix it or I'll fix it for you." And that he came away from that and decided to set up his own protocol. With no reference to the conference, he just did it.
You didn't know about it until it was made public?
Until it was made public. He later would claim that this meant he was the first person in Australia to have such a protocol. He was ahead of everybody, in other words. But it was, I mean, that's only a very partial truth. We failed. This was the biggest diocese in Australia because Sydney had been divided into separate dioceses. So Melbourne was the biggest. And now we'd lost the biggest diocese in Australia, which meant we no longer had that unanimity that we're all working together. You couldn't begin to claim it if the very biggest diocese of all had pulled out and was setting up its own. And of course, if you're setting up your own, and there's only one person who has to make decisions, you can move a lot faster than someone who's trying to bring on board 32 dioceses and 150 religious orders. That takes time, that takes discussion. To do your own one is a much quicker process. So he was able to finalise it very quickly. What he came up with is a lot to recommend it, but I had big problems with it too. The major one was the very first point of contact for a victim was a QC in a city office. That's who he had to go and see. And I felt that that was just too much for victims altogether. Towards hitting at a system where you went and saw a contact person, someone like yourself in your own home sometimes, and where you could feel far more relaxed and talk. And I felt that that was always a big weakness. The man he appointed I have great respect for. I think he was and is a good man, so I'm not criticising him, but I found the system was asking too much, that people go to a city office and see a QC, and that in any case he'd destroyed our unity.
Now, you mentioned before that you were, I think, interviewed by somebody, might be Ms. Brocky, in relation to comments you made at that conference leading up to the Bishops' Conference.
It was Jenny Brocky.
Jenny Brocky. Can I take you to tab 79?
Oh, that's in the other.
Yeah. Do you have that?
Yes.
Now, this is a letter from you, 8th of June 1996, to Archbishop Brambilla.
Yes.
Now, what were the circumstances of you writing this letter?
At that conference at Sydney University, best as I could see, there were about 80 people present, about 40 victims and 40 journalists. The questions came from the victims, and one of them was the question alluded to before: are you satisfied with the level of support you're getting from Rome? And that was the exact terms in which the question was asked. And I said, no. I mean, if you're talking to victims, you've got to be honest. And I said, no, I'm not. And I gave a bit of information on that. Now, one of the journalists present published that in the Australian the next day, changing a word and saying, are you happy with the support you're receiving from the Pope? So I made it personal. And printed my reply, no. And the nuncio took me up on that and said, this is being disloyal to the Pope. And so this is my reply to him. This letter is here. I was happy, of course, at being sort of brought up in that manner. I felt that the answer I'd given was the only honest answer I could give. And I pointed out some of the situations that had arisen and why I felt I'd had to answer in that way.
Well, let's just come to detail, if we can, of the letter. You indicated that indeed it was Rome you mentioned, and rather than the Pope. And over on the second page, you say that you've many times felt very lonely and very exposed, and that you'd appreciate more help.
Yeah.
And then you refer to the fact that it is only Rome that can give guarantees for the whole church.
Yes.
And it had not done so at that time. And you indicate you're left wondering why Rome hasn't given more leadership in the matter. What did you think was the answer to that wondering?
This was all Pope John Paul II. Look, again, if I'm to be honest, he handled abuse poorly. He always claimed the authority, and I think with authority goes the obligation of leadership. Imagine that way back in, say, something like 1987, to pick a date out of the air. Imagine that way back in, say, something like 1987, to pick a date out of the air. Imagine that he'd come to the microphone in St. Peter's Square one Sunday morning with a vast shock me to the core. It tells of widespread sexual abuse of minors by priests and during that shocked me to the core. it tells of widespread sexual abuse of mind. Responsibility, I'm going to act. And I call on every bishop in the world to act with me. We're going to deal with these people. There's no place for them in the church. We're going to reach out to victims. We're going to look at anything in the church which may have contributed, and we're going to get rid of it. And I call on every bishop to work victims. We're going to look at anything in the church which may have contributed, and we're going to get rid of it. And I call on every bishop to work with me in this. In fact, bishops take an oath of loyalty to the Pope. Well, I want to tell you that from now on, part of that oath of loyalty is being loyal to victims. If you're not loyal to victims, you're not loyal to me. Now, that would have got worldwide publicity. It would have sent out a message to the whole church. Instead, what we got from him was silence. Brambilla, as a result of this, back and forth with me, sent me a copy of a letter that the Pope had sent to the American bishops in about 93, I think it was. Now, it was a terrible letter. It blamed the media, first of all. Then it tended to minimise, and then it said, we'll pray for the victims. And I thought, if we, the bishops of Australia, had published a letter like that here, we'd have been torn to pieces. And yet that's the only thing that came out from the Pope up until, quite late in the 1990s, quite late. Until then, this was the only thing that had ever appeared. And the more I look at it, no, the Pope, it didn't fit into his image of church, and he couldn't deal with it. Maybe he'd never met it back in Poland, I don't know the whole, but he dealt with it badly. And I would always, a real leadership like that from the Pope would have been marvellous. And from subsequent popes, no, we still haven't had that kind of leadership, not even from Francis.
You, I think, agitated in the late 1990s for there to be some form of meeting in the Vatican to talk about these issues. Yeah.
Well, that was... in 1998, there was a synod for Oceania, and the bishops from all this part of the world were over there. And we had a meeting with Cardinal Ratzinger at the end. And I said to him, I asked him a public question. Couldn't we have a meeting with the Vatican over this issue? And he was a bit nonplussed by the question, but in fairness he answered and said, well, yes, if you want that, you must apply to the Secretary of State.
What was Cardinal Ratzinger's role at that
stage?
He
was the prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. He said, you need to apply to the Secretary of State. Fair enough, he's the one who coordinates the Curia. My purpose in the question was that I felt it was high time, long beyond high time, when we sat down with people in the Vatican to talk this through, because Rome's response up till then had been so poor. They were dismissing it as an Anglo-Saxon problem. It didn't exist anywhere else. It was just those dreadful Anglo-Saxons. They'd also dismissed it as a homosexual problem, because I'm sure you're aware, most of the victims of priests were male. So they dismissed it as a homosexual problem. I felt we really needed to sit down with them. So when we came home from that synod, I talked to Cardinal Clancy, and I urged him to write to the Secretary of State asking for such a meeting, and at the same time to write to the prefects, or the president, sorry, of the other English-speaking bishops' conferences. I felt we'd get more traction from the English-speaking ones than from others who might deny they had the problem. And he agreed to do that. So he wrote to them, and all of them actually responded to him, and similarly wrote to the Secretary of State. And as a result of that, the Secretary of State said, yes, he'd call such a meeting.
Perhaps if we can look at tab 84, that's in the second volume as well. Yes. Now, this is a letter from the
prefect of the Congregation for Clergy, Cardinal Castrillon Hoyos.
Thank you. Dated the 1st of February 2000 to Cardinal Clancy. And this reflects the decision, as you've said, of the Secretary of State to hold a meeting, and it invites two representatives of the Bishops' Conference, and then indicates in the last paragraph what it wants of them. Perhaps if we can scroll down. Now, in any of your discussions prior to this meeting happening, did you envisage that each conference would do what's set out in this last few paragraphs?
Well, we did our best to get together what statistics we could for Australia, and so did the other countries who were represented there. So yes, we did do some, such study as we could. Remember, we could never get full figures, because, say, in a religious order, the superior would handle a case or mishandle it, whichever, but he would leave no written records, so that when he went out of office and his successor came, quite literally, the successor did not know what had happened. So under those circumstances, it was impossible to get accurate figures. Now, if we can just turn to the next page, you're told that during the meeting there will be ample opportunity for discussion, and the purpose is to provide concrete suggestions to the Holy Father for his ultimate disposition. Suggestions about what? I suppose about what to do in response to the... As broad as that? Yeah. Now, you and Bishop Wilson. Attended the meeting, and if we can turn to tab 87, this is the report that you took with you as to the Australian situation, and you refer, as you've said, to the lack of records. And you also note that secrecy is still a problem. Yes. And then over the page, in the second paragraph, you say the amounts paid out is hard to obtain, and your best estimate is about $30 million. Now, this is in April 2000. I'd probably call that a guesstimate today. Was that based on Catholic Church insurance data? Probably that came into it. And then in the next paragraph, you refer to your best estimate that somewhere around 4 to 6% of priests and brothers have been guilty of a sexual offence, serious enough to have legal consequences. Yes. Where did you get that from? I'm not sure now. From such figures as we had. Because that's about guilt, offence, rather than an admission or a complaint which had been considered to be true by whoever received it, isn't it? I noticed too it refers to minors or adults. It does. There were always quite a number of those that were offences against adults. And this meeting about sexual abuse wasn't limited to children? The one with Rome? Yes. They probably saw it as limited to minors. Right. Because that was the big question in the air. So is it the case and people in Rome would have tended to dismiss the ones with adults? They would have said, probably it was the adult who was the instigator there. They would have tended to be defensive. Now, if we can just turn over to the next page, there's a heading, conflict with civil law. Yes. Now, by this stage, 2000, you well and truly understood that the canon laws that applied then didn't provide a proper response to survivors of child sexual abuse by the clergy. Yes. And you were saying in the conflict of civil law, you were giving
information about what you saw to be the conflicts.
Yes.
That's right. And then if we can turn over to the next page, you conclude before the next heading that the laws and procedures of the church must not prevent a bishop from obeying the reasonable laws of the state, and they must not prevent a bishop from following his conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that wasn't the case at the time you wrote this report, was it?
Sorry, what wasn't the case?
The laws and procedures of the church indeed did prevent a bishop in certain
I felt there
circumstances.
could be conflicts between our obligations under church law and our obligations under civil law.
And that was a key area of discussion you wanted to have in Rome.
Oh, yes.
Now, if we can then just turn to tab 88, you have that with you.
Yes.
Now, this is a document headed Some Personal Observations by yourself on the meeting that was held from the 1st to 4th of April. Now, perhaps if you could just take us through this, Bishop. Tell us first who was present.
Well, the list of people there on paper who do represent senior figures from a number of different Roman congregations, either the prefect or the what's he called, the vice prefect, anyway, the second in charge.
Bishop, there'll be a lot of people listening who can't see the document that you can see. Are there particular leaders of the church who were present at that meeting?
Well, the chairman of the whole meeting was Cardinal Dario Castillo Noyos. He was in charge of the Congregation for Clergy, a South American, whom I later found to have been one who was very difficult in this field, who was very slow to move at all. So it was a pity that someone like that. Sabat Terniak was also from that same congregation. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, he was the best of them. He'd, at one stage, I remember in a coffee break, he told me he'd been an apostolic nuncio, that is a church, the Pope's representative in certain countries. And he told me that he'd met this problem. So he knew what we were talking about. And he was the only one I had any confidence actually did know that much. The rest of them didn't seem to have victims or offenders themselves. So it was something abstract, something in book to the rest of them. He was the best of them. Then there was Bertone, and a couple of sessions Cardinal Ratzinger was there, but he came and went.
He was there as the head of the congregation.
Yes, as the head of that congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Yeah. Then there was Pier Giorgio Nesti. He was a sort of pious old man, but he was when it came out with the famous comment. Grocholewski and Pitao were from education and seminaries. Monterisi was from bishops. Marcello Zago from evangelizing of peoples. Pompedda was good too. He'd worked in the Rota with the Supreme Tribunal, and so he'd dealt with marriage cases for many years. As a result, he at least understood psychology. He had a very good understanding of psychology. With the Supreme Tribunal, and so he'd dealt with marriage cases for many years. As a result, he at least understood psychology. He had a very good understanding of psychology. He'd obviously done quite serious studies in the field. So he was the other one. Vigano and Pom, the two I could actually talk to, over.
Church were gathered, the ones resident in Rome were gathered at this meeting?
It's a very eminent meeting.
Yeah. Is there any significant leader missing from that group? Is there any one of the significant leaders at the time who's missing from that group?
No. The only really significant one, of course, would have been Pope John Paul II. Yeah. He wasn't there. But yeah, that's a quite eminent meeting altogether. That at least paid us that compliment. They'd send us the top people and not someone way down the line. And then there were two bishops each from the Antilles, Australia, Canada, England, Wales, Ireland. On the first day, each of the 9 provinces was given about half an hour to present the report. You've seen the Australian one, to present their report to the meeting. There was it always had, the whole thing went on in Italian and English. And so there had to be translations of things, which always slows things down a bit and gets in the way a bit of the communication. The second day was really disappointing. We found it was being a bit stage managed. There were 3 people they'd chosen to talk to us. The first was a lay moral theologian who talked about moral aspects of it. He was an American, a good man, but I felt he talked too much about the priest. It was still that accent there. The second one was a dead loss. He was a German psychiatrist, Professor Lutz, who seemed to have little personal experience and insisted on speaking in Italian, which he didn't speak terribly well. And so he was, it really wasn't getting across at all. So it was a bit of a loss. The third one was Gianfranco Ghirlanda. He was a very eminent canon lawyer in Rome, lectured at the Gregorian University, and he spoke again about canon law aspects of this. But they, always they were dealing with the priest more than they were dealing with the victim somehow. We got other talks. That's a normal Roman method of doing things. When you have a conference, you set up talks. But we felt that we were getting too close to the end of this and there'd not been any real discussion here. So we sort of demanded a time when we just spoke about the problem. And I put down there, say, what the 2 Canadians said. One had been appointed to a diocese of 36 priests, of whom 6 were in prison. The other one, even worse, found that he was appointed to a diocese and his predecessor, the bishop before him, was in prison for rape. This brought the conference alive, at least. They were hearing the gut stuff, of what the real world was like for us out there. Whereas we felt, were in their ivory tower. And I've made the comment here, I found them at the stage where the Australian bishops were back in the 1980s. There hadn't been the movement forward. They were still asking the questions of the 1980s. They really weren't understanding, the whole thing of what it was all about. And they couldn't take on new ideas. They tended to look down, I have to say this, on our Anglo-Saxon legal system. There were several disparaging remarks. I remember Bertone saying to me, a judge makes a decision and you're all bound by it. How ridiculous. This was his comment on, they felt that their law was far superior to ours. And also they were on, we have our law, you've got to fit that law. And I was trying to say to them, but just a minute, a law which may be perfectly good for a priest breaking the seal of confession, you can't transfer over here and expect the same law to work. So there were many problems, but the major one was that communication. Then I've said too that the Americans came in at this stage and wanted their administrative tribunals back, and the Vatican wouldn't touch that. But it took up a lot of time. I mean, on that I agreed with the Vatican. If you're going to apply permanent penalties, then you must have some sort of judicial process. Anything less is just not fair. But that, again, took up time. So I felt that, the communication really wasn't there. And then eventually they let us go, and the understanding was that all power rested with them.
Just coming back to the letter on the second page, you refer to a sermon you were given by the Archbishop's secretary of a major congregation, Nesti. Gave a sermon on the evils of young seminarians touching themselves while showering and advocated the use of paddles for washing and dressing to prevent this. Now, was that an indication of where their thinking was?
No, that was an indication of where Nesti's thinking was. In fairness, all the other members of the Curia were exchanging embarrassed grins while he was speaking, because it was so far out, and not one of them would have agreed with him. So that's a very, I put it there because he said it. but I wouldn't want you to conclude that's the considered view of the entire Vatican.
You then refer in the next paragraph to their view that it was a moral problem, and I think this is the source of the evidence you gave earlier in relation to repentance.
Yes.
And this was the occasion where you were told that you weren't Christian.
That's right, because you said you don't believe in repentance and forgiveness, and we are a church of forgiveness. Well, yes, we're a church of forgiveness, but we've got to put that together with prevention of future wrongs.
Was that said personally to you among a discussion just between the two of you?
No, he happened to be sitting quite close to me, and he said it directly to me. But that would have been a fairly... that idea would have been said by others there, that we must have forgiveness here.
You also say that those there seem to think that many accusations were false,
Yes.
whereas the information from the Australian scene was that more than 97% of accusations have been shown to be true.
That's what we're... Not only Australia, that's what I'd gathered from other English-speaking countries too, that overwhelmingly accusations were true. Now, I've sat for 2 hours and listened to a woman tell me a whole long, detailed story and then later admit she'd made the lot up, that it was all false. So I'm aware that there can be false accusations. But we've found so far in this field that unless there are monetary considerations come in, then overwhelmingly the accusations are true. When I say money, if a person believes that all they have to do is tell a story and someone will promptly give them, some large sum of money, then that can lead to false accusations, of course. But otherwise, no. We found, I've got 97% there, and I'd stick by that. Overwhelmingly, the accusations were true.
Now,
So much so that, I'll add this, one victim said to me, well, if that's so, then why don't you do away with towards healing and just believe every victim who comes in? 97%, isn't that good enough for you? And I said, we can't do that. The trouble is if we did that and believed every victim, then the 3% of false ones would grow, a large amount, because if there was money at the end, particularly, and it's, we had to listen to people, and we had to give the priest a chance to say his bit.
Now, at the time of this meeting, you were conscious of the 1922 instruction, Crimen Solicitationis?
Just. I'd only just become aware of it. It was in preparation for that Bishop Philip Wilson drew that document to my... And
how can that be that the Pope can issue a decree which is relevant to your work in both 1922 and again in 1962, and you not know about it as an Australian bishop?
The only answer I can give you is secrecy. The Vatican can sometimes be so secret that quite literally, quoting the Gospels, the left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. And that they can be so secret that even things like this remain secret and you don't know about them. But I did not know about the existence of this document until about 2000.
And you knew about it by virtue of your preparation for this meeting?
And the fact that Philip Wilson told me about it.
So
Had he not told me about it, I still wouldn't have known.
So the process of developing towards healing occurred without an understanding that the congregation wanted everything to go to them and to be kept secret.
Yes, yes. We did not know of the existence of that document. Furthermore, I think it's an instruction. Now, many people have the idea that everything that comes out of Rome is infallible and lasts forever. It doesn't. They have all grades of documents, and an instruction is quite a long way down. So it wasn't out there as some great important document. It was a procedural document, that's all.
So when you found out about it in 2000, did you consider that bishops, or indeed the Bishops' Conference in Australia, was bound to follow it?
Well, we've already made the decision to have towards healing and to follow that. And when they made that decision, the Australian bishops were well aware that they were outside church law and that their document had no standing in church law. They knew that.
And they were outside church law because of the various canons that talked about the procedures
That's right,
to be followed.
that it would need to be, a tribunal of 3 priests and all that, and follow the exact procedure in the code. And they understood why I was not suggesting we follow that. They saw it for themselves. And, I pay them the compliment that they were willing to put themselves on the line. It later came to the Congregation for the Clergy ordering an Australian bishop to give a new job to a priest who'd been accused but not convicted. And the bishop refused. You know the case, the Wollongong.
Father Nestor.
Yeah, Nestor. And Bishop Ingham refused. He said, my conscience doesn't allow me to give this man a new appointment. He's, as the civil law term, he's an unacceptable risk. And he was a completely unacceptable risk. But Bishop Ingham was putting his job on the line. Had push come to shove, the congregation would have insisted that he do it or else resign.
And so, with the situation the way it was, a priest who was subject to some adverse action as a result of towards healing could appeal to the Vatican and have the decision changed.
Could.
If they were successful in their appeal.
Towards healing relied to a very large extent on getting the priest to admit the offence and to accept that he couldn't continue to work as a priest. And at first we were quite successful in that. It later fell down because both sides changed.
What do you mean?
There were priests out there who felt that the bishops had thrown them to the wolves. And so as soon as they heard an accusation, they would approach the priest who'd been accused and say, admit nothing, say nothing, get yourself a lawyer, defend yourself. Don't admit to anything. While on the other side, there was particularly victims groups who were saying to victims, don't go near these people, get yourself a lawyer and go for the biggest sum of money you can get. And we found when it was lawyer versus lawyer, we weren't getting anywhere. The process was falling down and was not achieving what it once had.
Because there was less room for a pastoral response if it was lawyer versus
There was less room to get any sort of admission out of an offender. I mean, there were cases where the fellow denied it and the towards healing still found the man guilty. But as you well know, these cases are often he says, and no other evidence available. Whatever happened in private. And so to get that admission by the person was important.
Father Lucas had a role to play in gathering admissions, didn't he?
Earlier on.
When was that?
Oh, that would have been, I couldn't say when it started, but the very late 80s, the early 90s.
And what was his role then?
He was called in by bishops to deal, to help out. So in a sense to replace Monsignor Wallace, but never by doing what Monsignor Wallace had done. He had none of those powers to get rid of a man. So the system he evolved, and that he spoke to me quite openly about, was that he would get another priest, definitely not a bishop. He said if a bishop comes into it, the man will clam up and say nothing. Probably true. So he'd get another priest, and then these 2 priests would see this priest who was accused. They'd tell him what the accusation was, and they'd say in effect to him, if you're innocent, get a lawyer and defend yourself. But if in fact this is true, then isn't it better for you yourself, certainly for the victim, and isn't it far better for the church as a whole, that you admit it and that we deal with, that situation then? Now, I'd have to say he was very good at that. It worked. And he got quite a lot of admissions. One case that I'd referred to the Archdiocese, and it was a woman who'd been abused when she was about 14. And the priest admitted this. He was removed from all ministry from then on. He's never worked again. And she got what she wanted, which wasn't, she didn't want more. She wanted money for counselling, and that was arranged in such a way that she never saw a bill. It went directly from the psychologist to the diocese and was paid. And she went away happy. So he did achieve certain results. Now, in the process, he believed it was better not to keep notes, so he didn't. And, you know, other people will quarrel with that. You know, my own opinion would be that if anything is designed to have legal effects, then it should be in writing. So he should have kept notes. It was a bit of a problem. Sometimes when you're talking to a victim, it is difficult to stop them and say, no, I've got to write that down. Sometimes you've got to go with the flow, you know, let them talk and cry and whatever.
You can always write notes down after the
Yeah, I know, afterwards you can. But I'm just saying it does create some difficulty if you're trying to write it all as you go. True. But anyway, he didn't, and one may quarrel with that. But he did have some success, I have to say, in what he did.
Did he have the authority of the bishop to do that?
He must have, because he was acting with their consent.
So it was the bishop's decision?
He must have, because he was acting with their consent.
So it was the bishop's decision ultimately to say to the priest, out you go?
Once he got the admission from the priest, then the bishop could do that. You know, and when bishops were scratching around trying to find a substitute, and so when Brian's now, and when bishops were scratching around trying to find a substitute. And so when Brian came up with this, a lot of bishops said, yes, this is the best thing we've heard of so far.
Was that before the 1987 presentation by Father Lucas and Father Usher? Do you remember now whether the task that he ended up taking on was one that he was given or one that he took on himself?
He was given certain roles. You will have noticed in the papers you've got that he's appointed to any committee. The first one, and then again later on the committee that I was on. He was a member, as was John Usher. They were, you know, because they were the two who'd done some research and first presented it to us, they were seen as go-to people on this issue. And so they were given a certain promise. But I think your question is, was he doing this before that date?
Well, was he given it as a task for him to do by some person in authority, the Conference of Bishop, or was it something that he put forward that he would do, or is it something he just did?
I imagine that, well, to do it at all, he would have had to have had the consent of the individual bishop concerned. And I imagine that that's how it started. Notice that word imagine. I don't know. I imagine that's how it started, that in talking to an individual bishop, he could have suggested, well, look, I'm willing to meet this fella, and I think it's better that I do it rather than you, because if you do it, he'll clam up and I'm an authority thing. And he's probably right there. If a bishop came in, the priest would tend to get all defensive, whereas in talking to a fellow priest, he might be much more open.
And the removal of the faculties of that priest was available to the bishop to do.
The bishop could do that. Yeah, if he had admissions like this, then he could say, good, you know, you may no longer hear confessions, preach, etc. in this diocese, and you can't live in a parish. You know, he could take much away from him.
Could the priest then appeal to Rome?
In theory, yes. In practice, it just made admissions that he'd offended in this field. It'd be very difficult to appeal to Rome if you'd made admissions.
Although there's no record of the admission.
That's true. He could withdraw the admission, and then Rome would insist on a process. That's where that's where his system would have fallen down if a priest had withdrawn an admission and appealed to Rome.
Did Father Lucas's role continue during the Towards Healing days?
He was always there, and he always had a lot to say. I mean, he's a friend of mine. I could go out with him for a day and we could enjoy ourselves. But in dealing with him over these issues, he's a lawyer and he's a priest. And sometimes I'm very conscious of talking to the priest, a caring priest. At other times I'm very conscious of talking to a lawyer. No, I don't say that disparagingly.
Oh, I don't take it disparagingly.
Certainly not before a royal commission. But, you know, sometimes he could be parsing and analysing, like that business we referred to earlier. You know, send the documents to your lawyer and then they come under privilege. Now, Brian was capable of saying things like that. And then, you know, this is a lawyer I'm talking to here. Where's the priest? At other times I was very conscious of a good priest. At other times I didn't quite know who I was talking to.
Is he still doing it now, as far as you know, carrying out that role? I appreciate you left.
Since he's gone to Canberra, I'd say he's had a lot less, but you know, this is after my time, but I'd say he's had a lot less to do with this.
And by going to Canberra, do you mean he's Secretary of the Bishops' Conference?
Yes, he took on the job as Secretary of the Bishops' Conference. You know, he's a super efficient man. He's the best secretary the conference has ever had by a long way. You know, he's very, very competent, very, very efficient. He gets things done quite brilliantly.
Was the work he did that you've described, in your mind, consistent or inconsistent with Towards Healing?
Sorry?
The work that he did in visiting priests and the like, was that consistent or inconsistent with Towards Healing?
I'd say it occurred mainly before Towards Healing came into force.
I see.
So we're talking a period here at the earliest about 1988, at the latest the beginning of 1997. That was the period in which I was conscious. More, you know, I can't say for that whole period, but it was during that period that he would have done that kind of work.
And as far as you know, it was limited to the Archdiocese of Sydney?
No. So far as I know, it was limited to New South Wales, but he was called into other dioceses.
You want to set an appropriate time?
Yes, very well. We'll adjourn until 2 o'clock.